The dust kicked up by the stagecoach wheels settled slowly in the afternoon heat, leaving Sarah Mae Henderson standing alone on the wooden platform of Redemption Creek. Her worn leather satchel hung heavy at her side, containing everything she'd owned in this world: a few faded photographs, her mother's silver locket. On a letter she'd read so many times the ink had begun to blur. 3 years. 3 long years since she'd fled this place in the dead of night, her wedding dress still hanging in the wardrobe of her father's house. 3 years since she'd broken the heart of the only man who'd ever truly seen her soul. The town hadn't changed much. The same weathered buildings lined Main Street, their paint peeling under the relentless desert sun. The saloon's batwing doors still creaked in the wind, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the rhythmic hammering from the blacksmith shop. But everything felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the wide-open spaces of her childhood had shrunk to accommodate the weight of her mistakes. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the heat. She'd hoped to slip into town unnoticed, to find lodgings at the boarding house, and figure out her next move without stirring up old memories. But as she walked down the dusty street, heads turned, and whispers followed in her wake like tumbleweeds. The Henderson girl, she heard Mrs. Patterson murmur to her companion outside the general store. The one who ran off right before her wedding to young Coleman. Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. She'd known this moment would come eventually. The shame, the judgment, the weight of a choice she'd made when she was barely 19 and terrified of becoming just another rancher's wife. Trapped in a life that felt too small for her restless spirit, the boarding house sat at the end of Main Street, its white picket fence now gray with dust and neglect. Mrs. O'Malley. The proprietor emerged onto the porch as Sarah approached, her Irish accent still thick after 20 years in the American West. "Well, I'll be blessed," Mrs. O'Malley said, her weathered hands pressed to her apron chest. "Sarah Mae Henderson, as I live and breathe." "Hello, Mrs. O'Malley." Sarah managed a small smile. "I was hoping you might have a room available." The older woman's eyes softened with something between pity and understanding. "Child, you know there's always a place for you here, though I imagine there are some folks in town who might not be so welcoming." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I know what I did was wrong, leaving the way I did without a word to anyone. But I had my reasons." Mrs. O'Malley studied her for a long moment, taking in the way Sarah's once bright eyes now held shadows. Way her dress hung loose on her slender frame. "I'm sure you did, dear." "Come on then, let's get you settled." As they climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, Mrs. O'Malley's voice dropped to a whisper. "You should know, Sarah Mae, that James Coleman never did marry. There were plenty of eligible young ladies who tried to catch his attention, but he kept to himself mostly. Threw himself into building up his ranch, helping folks in town when they needed it." Sarah's step faltered. She'd hoped perhaps that James had moved on, found happiness with someone who could give him the simple, settled life she'd been too frightened to embrace. The knowledge that he'd remained alone all these years sat heavy in her chest, like a stone. "Does he... double quotes," she began, then stopped herself. She'd forfeited that right the night she'd climbed out her bedroom window and caught the midnight stage to San Francisco, leaving nothing behind. But a hastily scrawled note and a broken promise Mrs. O'Malley seemed to understand anyway. "He still lives on the ranch outside of town. Makes his living breeding horses now finest animals you ever did see. Folks say he's got away with the wild ones. Can gentle a Mustang that no one else can even get near." The irony wasn't lost. On Sarah, she'd been the wild one he couldn't gentle. Her room was small, but clean, with a window that looked out over the desert toward the distant mountains. Sarah set her satchel on the narrow bed and pulled out her mother's locket, running her thumb over the tarnished silver. Inside was a tiny daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, both of them so young and hopeful. They'd been married for 37 years when consumption took her mother. Her father had followed within 6 months, as if he couldn't bear to exist without his other half. That kind of love, complete, consuming, forever, had terrified 19-year-old Sarah Mae. The thought of giving herself so completely to another person, of losing herself in someone else's dreams, had sent her fleeing into the night like a spooked horse. Now, 22, she understood things differently. The world beyond Redemption Creek had taught her hard lessons about loneliness, about the kind of emptiness that couldn't be filled with adventure or independence or the hollow promises of men who wanted to possess rather than cherish. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. O'Malley peeked inside, her expression cautious. "Sarah May, dear, there's someone downstairs asking for you." Sarah's heart jumped. Could it be James? Had word of her return already reached him? She smoothed her hair and followed Mrs. O'Malley down the stairs, her pulse racing with equal parts hope and terror. But the man waiting in the boarding house parlor wasn't James Coleman. Sheriff Marcus Webb stood with his hat in his hands, his weathered face grave. Sarah had known Marcus since childhood. He'd been her father's friend and had always treated her with kindness, even after her scandalous departure. "Sarah May," he said, his voice gentle. "I heard you were back in town." "Hello, Marcus." She clasped her hands in front of her to keep them from trembling. "Is everything all right?" The sheriff's expression grew more serious. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news. It's about your father's ranch." Sarah's stomach dropped. The ranch had been in her family for 2 generations, the only real home she'd ever known. After her parents' deaths, she'd assumed it would wait for her return. A constant in a world that had proven frighteningly changeable. "What about it?" she managed to ask. Marcus turned his hat in his hands, clearly uncomfortable. The county had to sell it for back taxes about a year ago. "Sorry, Sarah May. If there had been any way to contact you?" The room seemed to tilt around her. "Sold. But I never received any notice, any letters. We tried sending word to San Francisco, but you'd moved on by then. The letters came back undelivered." Sarah sank into a chair, the weight of this new loss crushing down on her. She'd spent 3 years running from her past, only to discover that the past had been erased in her absence. The home she'd dreamed of returning to was gone, along with any hope of rebuilding the life she'd thrown away. "Who bought it?" she whispered. Marcus hesitated. "James Coleman." The words hit her like a physical blow. James owned her family's land, now the place where she'd learned to ride, where she'd played as a child, where she'd once dreamed of building a life with him before fear had driven her away. "I should go," she said, starting to rise. "Sarah May, wait. I think you should know James didn't buy the ranch to hurt you. When word came that it was going up for auction, he was the only one who bid. Said he wanted to keep it safe in case you ever came home." Fresh tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. Even after everything she'd done to him, James had protected the only piece of her past that remained. The knowledge of his continued kindness only made her shame burn brighter. That evening, Sarah walked the familiar streets of Redemption Creek as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She found herself at the edge of town, looking out across the desert toward the ranch that had once been her home. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from the chimney of the old house, and she wondered if James was there now, perhaps sitting on the porch where she'd once sat with her father, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple. Beautiful evening. Sarah spun around to find James Coleman standing a few feet behind her, leading a magnificent black stallion by the reins. Her breath caught in her throat. 3 years had only made him more handsome, his shoulders broader, his face more mature, though still kind. His dark hair was longer now, curling slightly at his collar, as his eyes held a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. "James," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. He studied her face in the fading light, and she saw the moment when he took in the changes in her, the weight she'd lost. The shadows under her eyes, the way her spirit seemed dimmed like a candle burning low on oil. "Sarah May." His voice was quieter than she remembered, more careful. "Mrs. O'Malley said you'd come back." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of 3 years and 1,000 unspoken words hanging between them like a canyon too wide to cross. "I heard about the ranch," she said finally. "About what you did?" James looked out toward the distant mountains, his jaw tight. "Your father was a good man." The land deserved better than being carved up and sold to strangers. Thank you, she whispered. I know I have no right to your kindness, not after. Don't. His voice was sharp enough to cut, and Sarah flinched. When he looked at her again, his eyes held a pain so deep it took her breath away. Don't apologize for leaving. We both know you did what you had to do. That's not true, Sarah said, tears spilling down her cheeks. I was scared, James. Scared of loving you so much it would swallow me whole. Scared of becoming someone I didn't recognize. But I was wrong, and I've spent 3 years paying for that mistake. James stepped closer, his free hand rising as if to touch her face before he caught himself and let it fall to his side. Where did you go, Sarah May? Where have you been all this time? The question she'd been dreading. What could she tell him? About the lonely years in San Francisco, working as a seamstress in a cramped apartment? About the men who'd courted her with empty promises, looking for a pretty ornament rather than a partner? About the nights she'd lain awake thinking of his gentle hands and wondering if she'd thrown away the only real love she'd ever find? I went to San Francisco, she said simply. I thought I wanted to see the world, to be independent. But the world is bigger and lonelier than I ever imagined. Something shifted in James's expression, a softening around his eyes that gave her hope. Are you planning to stay in Redemption Creek? Sarah looked out at the desert, painted now in deep purples and blues by the approaching night. No, I don't have anywhere else to go, but I don't know if I belong here anymore either. James was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, The ranch house is empty most nights. I've been staying in the foreman's cabin. Couldn't bring myself to sleep in your parents' bed, if you wanted to see it, to say goodbye properly. The offer hung between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Sarah knew she should refuse. Being alone with James would only make leaving again that much harder. But the chance to walk through her childhood home one more time, to touch the walls that held so many memories, was too precious to pass up. I'd like that, she said. They walked in comfortable silence across the desert, the horses' hooves making soft sounds in the sand. The ranch house sat exactly where Sarah remembered it. A modest 2-story building, with a wraparound porch, and her mother's flower garden now grown wild with desert blooms. James tied his horse to the hitching post and led her up the familiar. Steps inside, everything was exactly as she remembered. Her mother's rocking chair sat by the fireplace, her father's pipe still on the mantelpiece. Sarah ran her fingers along the kitchen table, where they'd shared countless meals, where she'd done her lessons as a child, where James had asked her to marry him on a spring evening 3 years ago. You kept everything, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I couldn't bear to change it, James admitted. I kept thinking you might come back someday, and I wanted it to be here waiting for you. Sarah turned to face him, seeing the truth written plainly in his expression. Despite everything she'd done, despite the pain she'd caused him, he'd never stopped hoping for her return. The realization broke something open in her chest, letting all the love she'd tried so hard to bury come flooding back. James, I don't, he said again, but gentler this time. Don't say anything you might regret tomorrow. What if I won't regret it? The words came out in a rush, all her carefully constructed walls crumbling at once. What if the only thing I've ever regretted was leaving you? James stared at her for a long moment, his hands clenched at his sides as if he was fighting not to reach for her. You broke my heart, Sarah May. Not just when you left, but the way you left. Goodbye. No explanation, just gone like you'd never existed at all, I know, she whispered. I know, and I'm sorry. I was a coward, and I hurt the best man I've ever known because I was too afraid to trust in something beautiful. And now, his voice was barely audible. What's different now? Sarah took a step closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold. In his brown eyes, close enough to smell the familiar scent of leather and sage that had always made her feel safe. Now I know what it means to be truly alone, she said. Now I understand that love isn't something that diminishes you, it's something that makes you more than you could ever be by yourself. Now I know that the only thing scarier than giving your heart completely is spending your whole life wishing you had. James's resolve seemed to crumble all at once. He closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps, his hands coming up to cup her face with a tenderness that made her knees weak. "I never stopped loving you," he said, his forehead pressed against hers. "God help me, I tried, but I never could." "James," she breathed, and then his lips were on hers, and 3 years of loneliness and regret melted away. It's like snow in spring sunshine. The kiss was everything she remembered, and more gentle but desperate, familiar but entirely new. His hands tangled in her hair, and she pressed closer to him, trying to memorize every detail of this moment, in case it was all she'd ever have. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his chin on top of her head. "What happens now, Sarah May? I can't survive losing you again." Sarah pulled back to look at him, her heart full to bursting with love and hope and the terrifying, wonderful possibility of a second chance. "Then don't lose me," she said simply. "I'm tired of running, James. I want to stay. I want to build a life here with you if you'll have me, if I'll have you." James laughed, a sound like water over stones. "Sarah May Henderson, I've been waiting for you for 3 years. I'd wait 3 more if I had to." "You don't have to wait anymore," she said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him again. "I'm home." As if summoned by her words, a warm wind swept across the desert, carrying with it the scent of sage and wildflowers and the promise of rain. Through the open window, Sarah could see the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, bright and constant as the love she'd been fool enough to run from and blessed enough to find again. James pulled her close, and she let herself melt into his embrace, finally understanding what her parents had known all along, that real love didn't make you smaller. It made you infinite. It gave you roots deep enough to weather any storm and wings strong enough to soar. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the mesquite and sage, carrying their joy out across the endless western sky. And for the first time in 3 years, Sarah May Henderson was exactly where she belonged. Epilogue 6 months later, Sarah May Coleman stood in the same spot where she'd first encountered James on her return to Redemption Creek, but now the desert bloomed with spring wildflowers, and the simple gold band on her finger caught the morning light like a promise kept. The wedding had been small. Just the townspeople who'd known them both since childhood. Mrs. O'Malley, crying happy tears in the front row, and Sheriff Webb, officiating with a grin that split his weathered face in two. Sarah had worn her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame, carried a bouquet of dessert roses that James had picked himself at dawn. Now she was waiting for him to return from town with supplies, her first spring as husband, and wife stretching out before them like an uncharted territory full of possibilities. The ranch was thriving under James's careful management, and Sarah had discovered a talent for training the gentler horses, finding peace in the patient work of building trust with creatures as skittish as she had once been. She heard hoofbeats, and turned to see James riding toward her, his face bright with excitement. He swung down from his horse and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed with pure joy. "What's got you so happy?" she asked, as he set her down. "Letter came for us today," he said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "From the territorial governor. He wants to buy 12 of our horses for the cavalry." Sarah's eyes widened. It was the kind of opportunity that could secure their future, establish them as the premier horse breeders in the territory. "James, that's wonderful." "It is," he agreed, but his expression grew serious. "Sarah May, this would mean traveling. Sometimes going to military posts to deliver the horses, maybe even as far as Fort Collins. I know how you feel about leaving, and if you're not comfortable—" Sarah silenced him with a kiss, her heart overflowing with love for this man who always put her feelings first. "James Coleman," she said when they broke apart, "I'm not afraid of traveling with you. The difference between running away and going on an adventure is who you have beside you. And as long as I have you, I can go anywhere." James smiled, the expression transforming his face like sunrise over the mountains. "Mrs. Coleman, I do believe you're going to be the most remarkable partner a man could ask for." "Partner," Sarah repeated, tasting the word. "I like the sound of that." As they walked back toward the house hand in hand, Sarah caught sight of a hawk circling high overhead, riding the desert thermals with effortless grace. Once, she would have envied that bird its freedom, its ability to go anywhere the wind might take it. Now she understood that true freedom wasn't about having no ties. It was about choosing the ties that made you stronger. It's the love that gave your life meaning and purpose. The desert wind picked up, warm and welcoming, carrying the scent of rain and new beginnings. Sarah squeezed James's hand and smiled, knowing that whatever adventures lay ahead, it would face them together under the endless western sky. Their love story had begun with separation and fear. It survived betrayal and heartbreak, and had found its way back to redemption through forgiveness and second chances. It was a love worthy of the vast, unforgiving, beautiful frontier that had shaped them both.